In the spring of 1887, in the high country above the Madison Valley, in the Montana Territory, a woman of 28 stood at the edge of a dry wash and looked down at the wreck of a mail coach that had lain there, broken and forgotten, for 11 years. The men of the town of Bell Crossing had a name for what she meant to do with it, and the name was not kind. She had $31 to her name, a borrowed team of 2 oxen, and a set of farrier's tools that had belonged to a dead man. The coach below her was a ruin. Its roof had caved, its wheels had rotted to the felloes, and the boot at its rear had been pried open and emptied by every drifter who had passed in 11 years. Anyone with sense could see there was nothing in it worth the hauling. She was not looking at what anyone with sense could see. She was looking at the door of the rear compartment, which had never once been opened because it had no handle, no hinge anyone could find, and no seam a knife could enter. And she had begun, already, to understand why. The thing about a sealed door is that it tells you someone meant it to stay shut. That is a different matter from a thing merely abandoned. You will hear, before this is finished, how a door with no handle came to hold the one truth a whole valley had agreed to forget. Stay with it. The opening was slower than the men who laughed expected, and the end was quieter than they could have borne. Her name was Hannah Foss, and she had come to the Madison country the way most people came, which was poorly and against her will. 2 months before, the man she had kept house for in Bozeman, a freight agent named Coyle, had told her there was no more work and no more room, and had set it in the doorway with her bag already on the step. He had a new wife coming from the east, he said, and a house was a house, and there was no place in it now for a hired woman. However good her work had been, he did not meet her eyes when he said it. She had not argued. Arguing with a man who had decided a thing was like striking a cold anvil with a bare hand. So she had taken the road south with her father's tools on her back, the heavy leather roll of them dragging at her shoulders for 40 miles of dust and frost, because the tools were the only thing in the world that were truly hers, and a person who can shoe a horse and mend an iron rim does not starve quickly, even when she is a woman, and no one will say so to her face. She had slept 2 nights in the open on that road, the second one cold enough that she had wrapped the tools in her own blanket against the damp and gone without herself, because a rusted chisel was a harder thing to replace than a night's comfort. Her father had been a farrier and a wheelwright, both a trade that married fire to iron and iron to wood, and he had taught her at the forge from the time she was small enough to need a box to stand on. He had been a patient man with a slow voice, and he had told her things she had not understood until years after he was in the ground. The most important of them was this. He had said that iron remembers the hand that worked it, and that if you wished to open a thing another man had closed, you did not fight the lock. You listened for the place where the maker had grown tired or careful or afraid, because every closed thing has such a place, and the place will tell you what the man was thinking when he shut it. She had thought it was only a saying. She would learn, in the wash above Bell Crossing, that it was an instruction. Bell Crossing was a town that had been larger once. A spur line had been promised it in the 70s, and had gone instead to a town 40 miles east, and the people who remained had the particular sourness of those who had been passed over and knew it. When Hannah came down out of the hills and asked at the livery for work, the man there looked at her tools and her dress and laughed, not cruelly, but in the way a man laughs at a thing he has already decided cannot be. She mended a wheel for him that afternoon, for the price of a meal, and he stopped laughing. But he did not offer her work. He offered her a place to sleep in the loft and the loan of his oxen if she ever found a fool's errand worth them. That was how he said it, a fool's errand. He could not have known the words would follow her down into the wash. She heard about the coach from an old man named Pruitt, who swept the church and remembered everything. He told her of it the way men tell stories they no longer believe, as a curiosity, a thing to fill an evening. There had been a mail coach, he said, that ran from the territorial offices down to the settlements along the river, carrying letters and land filings and the small business of a growing country. In the autumn of 1876, it had gone off the grade above the Wash in a storm, and the driver had been killed, and the coach had never been recovered because the company that owned it had folded that same winter and no one had been left to care. The mail it carried had been written off. The families who had been expecting word, expecting deeds, expecting the documents that made a claim had simply never received them. And the Wash had kept the coach, Pruitt said, the way the ground keeps everything in this country, slowly and without mercy. Hannah asked him one question. She asked whether anyone had ever opened the rear compartment. Pruitt looked at her strangely and said that there was no rear compartment, only the boot, and the boot had been empty for years. She did not correct him. She had not yet seen the coach. Even so, she had repaired enough company vehicles in Bozeman to know that a mail coach of that make carried a sealed strongbox compartment behind the passenger box, separate from the boot, built to hold registered mail and bonded documents, and that such a compartment was made by the maker, to be opened only at the destination office with a key that traveled separately. If the coach had gone down with its registered mail aboard, and if no one had ever brought the key, then the compartment had been sealed for 11 years with everything still inside it. She thanked Pruitt and did not sleep that night. The next morning she walked the 4 miles up the grade to look. The coach lay on its side at the bottom of the dry wash where it had come to rest, half buried in the gravel that 11 springs of runoff had pushed against it. The wood was silver and split. The iron was the deep red-brown of long rust, the color of dried blood, the color of a thing the weather has been eating for more than a decade. The boot at the rear hung open and empty as Pruitt had said. Forward of the boot, set into the body of the coach where the passenger box ended, was a second iron door, and that door was shut. She climbed down into the wash and put her hand on it. It was cold even in the spring sun, the way buried iron stays cold, and it did not move, and there was no handle on it anywhere. She ran her fingers around its edge and found no seam wide enough for a blade. Whoever had built it had meant it to defeat exactly the kind of man who had emptied the boot. It had. For 11 years it had. She went back down to Bell Crossing and told the liveryman she wanted the loan of his oxen. He asked her what for, and when she told him, he laughed again, and this time several other men were in the livery, and they laughed too. They asked her what she thought she would find. A rotted coach was worth nothing. The wood was punk, and the iron was scrap. A blacksmith would not pay to cart. One of them, a heavy-set man named Dell, who held a note on half the town and liked to be seen as its cents, told her plainly that she was wasting a borrowed team on a wreck that 20 stronger men had already stripped. He said it kindly, which was worse. He told her to find honest work. He said a woman alone in this country had no business chasing buried junk, and that the only thing she would haul out of that wash was a lame ox and a lesson. The other men nodded. It was the kind of nodding that has decided a thing. Hannah did not argue. She had learned the uselessness of it in Coyle's doorway. She only asked the liveryman a second time whether she might have the oxen, and offered to shoe every animal in his barn through the summer in exchange. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in him, perhaps the memory of the wheel she had mended without being asked, made him say yes. Dell shook his head and went out. The matter was settled in the town's mind as foolishness. Hannah took the oxen and the chain and went back up the grade, and the laughter went with her. The whole 4 miles, the way a sound will when you cannot put it down. It took her 3 days only to get the coach out of the gravel, and those 3 days taught the town nothing, because no one came to watch. She dug the runoff gravel away from the lower side with a shovel in her hands, working from the cool of dawn until the sun stood overhead and the wash became an oven, then resting in the thin shade of the wreck and working again until dark. The gravel was packed hard as mortar where the water had left it, and it came away in plates that she had to break with a shovel edge before she could lift them. By the end of the first day, her palms had blistered through the calluses a forge had given her, and she wrapped them in strips torn from her spare shift and went on. She found the coach was heavier than its ruin suggested because the iron frame beneath the rotted wood was sound, and the sealed compartment, when she cleared the dirt from its underside, was a box of riveted plate that had not given an inch to 11 years of weather. She knelt and ran her hand along the underside of it and felt the rivets standing proud and regular, each one set by a maker who had been paid to make a thing that would not open. That told her something. A thing built that well had been built to protect something that mattered. Men do not rivet plate around scrap. On the fourth day she chained the oxen to the frame and brought the coach up out of the wash. It came slowly, grinding through the gravel, the chains singing with strain, the oxen leaning into the yoke while she walked beside them and spoke to them low and steady, the way her father had spoken to frightened horses. When the wreck finally crested the lip of the wash and stood on level ground in the morning light, she sat down on a rock and looked at it for a long time. It was the first time in 11 years the thing had been in the open. She did not feel triumph. She felt the particular soberness of a person who has committed herself past the point of turning back, and who now must make good or be the fool they all said she was. She hauled it not to the town but to a flat place, a half-mile out, near the liveryman's far pasture, where she could work without an audience and without an argument. She had no wish to perform. She wanted the door open, and she wanted to be alone with whatever was behind it, because some part of her already suspected that what was behind it would not be a thing a person wanted a crowd to see. For 2 days, she studied the door before she touched a tool to it. This was the part her father would have understood, and the town never would. To the men of Bell Crossing, opening a locked box meant force, a pry bar, and a heavy arm, and the fact that 20 strong men had failed to open the boot of this coach was proof to them that there was a stronger man's job in it that none of them would waste a day on. The compartment, though, had not been pried at. It had been ignored because it had no handle and gave no purchase, and offered the eye nothing to attack. Hannah did not attack it. She sat before it in the grass and looked at it the way her father had taught her to look at a closed thing, listening for the place where the maker had grown careful or afraid. She found, after a full day, the maker's marks. Stamped faintly into the lower corner of the iron plate, almost effaced by rust, was the name of the firm that had built the coach body, and a serial run, and a small symbol she recognized from her years among freight equipment as the mark of a registered mail fitting. The compartment was a standard pattern. She had seen its like opened a dozen times in the Bozeman yard, always with the traveling key, and she knew that the lock was not in the door at all. The door was a blind. The true mechanism was a rotating bar inside the frame, turned by a key that entered through a hole disguised as a rivet head, and the whole of it had been designed so that a thief working on the door itself would never find the lock because the lock was not where the door was. It was a clever cruelty. It assumed the only people who would ever try to open it were thieves, and it was right about everyone for 11 years. It had not assumed a farrier's daughter who knew where the false rivet would be. She did not have the key. No one had ever had the key in Bell Crossing. A farrier who has spent her life at a forge, however, does not need a key to turn a bar of iron she can reach. She needed only to reach it. And reaching it meant cutting, slowly and exactly, through a single rivet head in the frame, the false one, without distorting the bar behind it, so that she could turn the mechanism by hand the way the absent key would have turned it. It was the kind of work that could not be hurried and could not be forced, and it was the precise opposite of everything the strong men of the town believed about opening a box. She built a small forge in the grass from stones, and her own bellows. She heated her chisels and drew their edges fine. And she began. This is the place to tell you, before the door comes open, what manner of patience this country asked of the people who survived it, because Hannah's was the kind. She worked the rivet for the better part of 4 days. It was a thing the size of a thumbnail, and it stood between her and 11 years of silence, and she could not see it move. She would heat a chisel, set it, tap it with a small hammer in strokes so light they would have looked to a watcher like idleness, and then stop and feel the metal with her bare fingers to know whether she had bitten the rivet or the bar behind it. On the second day a thunderhead came up over the western peaks, and she covered her small forge with her own body and a wet sack until it passed, and lost half a day to the wet, and did not curse it, because cursing the weather in that country was a habit of men who did not last. Twice she nearly cut too deep. Both times she stopped and let the work cool, and her hands steady, before she went on. The first time her chisel skated, and she felt the bright shock of it skip toward the bar, and she set the tool down and walked away from the coach entirely, out into the grass, and stood with her back to it until her heart had quieted, because her father had told her that a frightened hand cuts where a calm hand would not. The wrecker asks how hard. She heard him say, and the craftsman asks how exactly, and she heard him say it again with every stroke. On the evening of the 4th day, the rivet head came away clean in her palm, no larger than a seed, and behind it she saw the bright, unrusted end of the locking bar, untouched by weather for 11 years, because the frame had sealed it whole. She did not open the door that night. She sat with the small bright thing in her hand and watched the light go off the mountains, and she thought about her father, who had died of a winter cough 3 years before, alone in a cold room because she had been across the territory keeping another man's house and had not reached him in time. Grief is a thing you carry in the body, not the mind, and hers came up through her hands as she sat there, the same hands he had taught. She let it come, and she let it go. In the morning she would turn the bar. She wanted to meet whatever was inside with steady hands and a clear head, and so she gave the grief its night and kept the morning for the work. At first light, she heated a length of square stock, drew it to fit the slot where the false rivet had been, and seated it against the end of the locking bar. Then she turned it. The bar had not moved in 11 years, and it did not wish to move now, and for a long moment she thought the rust had welded it past saving. She did not force it. She backed off, worked a little oil into the slot, warmed the frame with a cloth she had heated at the forge so the iron would give, and tried again, slowly, leaning her whole weight into the turn, but adding it the way you add weight to a frightened animal, gradually, so the thing never panics and breaks. The bar gave. It turned a quarter, then a half, with a deep grinding complaint that she felt in her teeth, and then there was a heavy sound from within the door, the sound of a bolt drawing back that had been shot home in the autumn of 1876 by a man now 11 years dead. The door did not swing. It had no hinge that worked. It sat loose now in its frame, though, and she got her fingers into the gap and drew it free and set it in the grass. Cold air came out of the compartment. It was the cold of a place that has been closed against the world for a very long time, and it carried a smell of old paper and oil and iron, and Hannah Foss knelt in the spring grass of the Madison country and looked into a space no living person had seen since before she was a grown woman. For a moment she did not reach in. Some doors, once open, cannot be shut again, and she knew it. Inside, packed and strapped exactly as a careful man had left them, were the registered mail pouches of the autumn of 1876. There were 4 of them, canvas, gone stiff and dark, the buckles green with age but holding. And there was a 5th thing, not a pouch, a flat-iron document case of the kind used to carry bonded papers, the territorial seal still pressed into the wax that closed it, the wax unbroken. The thieves who had emptied the boot had taken the loose letters and the small valuables and had never known that the true cargo, the registered and bonded cargo, the cargo that mattered, lay sealed behind a door they could not open 4 feet from their hands. It had ridden out the storm and the wreck and 11 years of weather, and it was whole. She did not open the pouches in the field. She carried them down one at a time over 2 days. the oxen drawing the last load, and she laid them out in the loft of the livery and went through them by lamplight, with the care of a person handling the belongings of the dead, which is what they were. Most of the letters were ordinary and heartbreaking in the way ordinary letters become when the people who wrote them and the people who waited for them are long past helping. A mother writing to a son, a man writing to the woman he meant to send for, notices of debts that had since been paid or forgiven or carried to the grave. She set those aside to be delivered where they could be, and many could not, and she felt the weight of each one. She let those go to be delivered where they could be. It was the iron document case, though, that changed the matter from sorrow into something with edges. And it is here that you should lean close, because the thing the valley had agreed to forget was inside it. She broke the territorial seal because she had the right of no one and the right of anyone, and she lifted out a sheaf of land filings, bonded and registered and stamped by the territorial office in the autumn of 1876, every one of them a legal claim to a parcel of land in the Madison Valley, tiled and paid for by the settlers who had sent them down on that coach to be recorded. They had been recorded. The settlers had done everything the law required. They had filed and paid and sent the bonded copies down for the office to seal and return. And the coach had gone off the grade in a storm, and the copies had never come back, and the office had folded, and over 11 years a great many of those parcels had been quietly declared abandoned for want of proof of claim, and bought up for the price of back taxes by the men who held the notes in Bell Crossing. By Dell chiefly, by the heavy-set man who held the note on half the town and had told her kindly to find honest work. Hannah sat in the loft with the lamp low and understood what she was holding. It was not treasure in the way the town used the word. It was proof. It was the registered, bonded, sealed proof that a dozen families who had been told they never properly owned their land had owned it all along, had done everything rightly, and had been robbed not by a thief in the dark, but by a slow and patient and entirely legal machinery. The men who had laughed at her for hauling a wrecked coach up out of a wash had been laughing at the thing that undid them, and they had not known it. And she found she took no pleasure in that. She felt only the gravity of a person who has been handed a truth and must now decide what kind of person she will be in the carrying of it. She could have used it as a club, a different person would have. She could have walked into the town and laid the bonded filings on the table at the land office and watched the men who had stripped the valley scramble, and there would have been a satisfaction in it. Her father, though, had not taught her satisfaction. He had taught her to mend. And so, over the weeks that followed, she did a slower and harder and far more thorough thing. She found the families. Some still lived in the valley as tenants on land that had been their own. Some had gone, and she traced them through Pruitt's long memory and the letters themselves, which named cousins and towns and trades. To each she brought the bonded copy of their own filing, the document that proved the claim the territory had erased, and she did not make a speech, and she did not ask for thanks. She put the paper in their hands and told them plainly what it was and where it had been and what it meant, and she let them feel the weight of it themselves. There was a woman named Esther Vane, near 60, who had been a young wife in 1876 and had filed on a quarter section with her husband and had lost it to abandonment 3 years after he died, and who now kept chickens on a strip of ground a man named Dell allowed her to use. Hannah brought her the bonded filing with her dead husband's signature on it, and the territorial seal beside it, and Esther Vane held it in 2 hands and did not speak for a long while. Then she said, in a voice quiet but firm, that she had been told for years that they had never done it properly, that her husband had been careless, that the fault was theirs. She said she had come to half believe it. Hannah told her the fault had never been theirs, that her husband had done every single thing the law asked, and that the proof had been sealed in an iron box 4 miles up the grade for 11 years because no one had thought a woman with a farrier's tools worth letting near it. Esther Vane wept then, not loudly, And Hannah sat with her until she had finished, and neither of them said anything more because there was nothing that needed saying. A matter of the law took longer and was less satisfying, as the law usually is. Hannah did not go to Dell. She went to the territorial recorder 40 miles east in the town the spur line had favored, riding a borrowed mare 2 days each way with the iron case wrapped in sacking and lashed behind her saddle, and she laid the bonded and sealed filings before a clerk and let the seals do the work that no accusation could have done. The clerk was a young man who began by telling her the office could not act on hearsay, and she did not raise her voice. She set the first sealed filing on the counter and asked him only to compare its register number against his own books, and to tell her then whether it was hearsay. He went and got the ledger. A bonded territorial filing with an unbroken seal is not a thing a clerk can wave away. It is the law's own word against the law's own error. The recorder himself came out before she had finished, an older man who had held the office through the very years the coach lay in the wash, and he examined the seals and the dates and the register numbers that matched the office's own surviving books. And his face changed as a man's face changes, when he understands he is looking at the proof of a thing he had been told never happened. The machinery that had quietly turned the valley's land into Dell's holdings began, just as quietly, to turn the other way. It did not happen in a day or a month. It happened, parcel by parcel, the way she had opened the door, with patience and exactness rather than force, and there was nothing Dell or the men who held the notes could do, because you cannot argue with a seal you did not break and a date you cannot move. Dell himself she never confronted, and this is the part the town found hardest to understand, for they had expected, once the truth came out, a reckoning. There was none. What there was a man who had built his standing in Bell Crossing on holdings that the recorder's office now found had never lawfully been his, and who watched, over a season, those holdings returned to the families he had taken them from, and who found that the standing went with the land. He was not jailed. The robbery had been legal in its every step, which was the whole horror of it. A man whose importance rested on other men's land, though, does not stay important when the land goes home. And Dell grew quiet, and then he grew absent, and by the autumn he had sold what little remained truly his, and gone east, and the valley closed over the place where he had been the way the wash had closed over the coach. He simply became a thing that had happened, and then a thing that was over. The liveryman whose oxen had hauled the coach said to Hannah one evening that he had been among the men who laughed, and that he was ashamed of it. She told him he had also been the man who said yes when she asked for the team, and that the yes was what mattered, and that he should let the laughing go. He did not entirely. He gave her the loft for as long as she wanted it, though, and he sent her every animal in the county that needed shoeing, and word went out from his barn that the farrier in Bell Crossing was the one who had opened the coach, and that she did good work, and that a person would be a fool to laugh at her. The word fool had turned all the way around. It took a wrecked mail coach and 11 years and 4 days of light hammer strokes to turn it, and turn it did. Esther Vane got her quarter section back in the autumn of that year. Hannah was there the day the recorder's letter came, and she watched the old woman walk out to the edge of the ground that was hers again and stand in the long grass with her hand shading her eyes, looking at it the way a person looks at a thing they had given up grieving for because grieving had grown too heavy. Hannah did not go out to her. Some moments belonged to one person. She stood at the fence and watched, and then she went back to her forge, because there were horses to shoe and the day was not yet over. She stayed in the Madison country. She had come to it poorly and against her will, and she had thought of it as a place she was passing through on her way to somewhere a person could begin again, but the coach had rooted her. She set up a proper smithy the next spring on a piece of ground the liveryman sold her cheap, a low building of squared logs with a stone forge. She laid herself, course by course, the way her father had laid his. She worked iron and wood the way he had, Fire married to metal and metal to wood, and the families whose land she had returned brought her their work first and always, not out of debt, for she would not let it be a debt, but out of the plain human wish to give your trade to the hands that did right by you. She mended their wheels and shod their teams, and set the iron rims that held their wagons together through the hard roads of that country. When a young man from a returned family asked to learn the trade, she took him on, and taught him the way she had been taught with the slow voice and the patient hand, and told him the things her father had told her, so that the saying about the maker who grows careful or afraid did not die with her. She grew, over years, into the thing the town had not been able to imagine when it laughed at her in the livery, which was simply a respected woman who was good at a difficult trade. The iron document case she kept. She emptied it of the filings which went to their rightful owners, and she cleaned the rust from it and oiled it, and she kept it on the shelf above her forge where another smith might have kept a clock. People asked her sometimes why she kept an old iron box that held nothing, and she would say that it had held everything once, and that a thing which has held the truth is worth keeping even when it is empty, the way a person keeps the tools of the dead. She never said more than that. She was not a woman who made speeches, and the valley had learned not to ask her for them. Years on, when she was old and her hands had begun at last to lose the steadiness that had cut a seed-sized rivet from a locking bar, a young man came through Bell Crossing who was writing down the history of the valley, and he asked her about the coach because it had become a story by then, the kind that grows and softens in the telling. He asked her how she had known there was anything behind the sealed door when 20 strong men had looked at the wreck and seen only scrap. Hannah Foss thought about it for a while. Then she told him what her father had told her, that iron remembers the hand that worked it, and that a closed thing always has a place where the maker grew careful or afraid, and that the place will tell you what he was thinking when he shut it. She told him she had not known what was inside. She had only known that someone had taken great trouble to seal it, and that men do not take great trouble over nothing, and that the trouble itself was the clue. The strong man had seen a worthless wreck. She had seen a door someone was determined no one should open, and she had wanted, more than she had wanted anything in a hard life, to know why. The young man asked her one more thing. He asked whether, after all of it, she felt the years of laughter had been worth answering. She said she had never set out to answer them. She had set out to open a door. The answering had come on its own, the way a true thing answers a false one simply by existing without raising its voice. And then she said, the only thing in the whole conversation that he wrote down word for word, because it stayed with him the rest of his life. She said that the world is full of doors that men have agreed to leave shut because no one can find the handle, and that behind a great many of them is the proof of something the world would rather forget, and that all it takes, most times, is one person patient enough to listen for the place where the maker grew afraid. The iron box is still in the Madison country, they say, kept by the grandchildren of the families whose land it carried home. It holds nothing. It has held nothing for a long time. Yet on a high shelf in a valley that once agreed to forget what it had done, an empty iron box that a woman hauled up out of a wash and opened alone, when they had all called her crazy for trying, sits in the light of a window and catches the warmth of the afternoon sun, the way the worn handle of a tool catches it, or the way the truth does, when at last someone has been stubborn enough to let it out. Have you ever known a thing everyone agreed to throw away that turned out to hold the one truth they could not afford to find? Tell me what it was. And if a story like this one stays with you, there is another waiting, of a different woman and a different sealed thing in this same hard and honest country.